The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the air inside the canvas command tent still felt wet enough to drink. Moisture clung to the map boards, to the acetate overlays, to the sleeves of every uniform in the room. Nui Dat breathed like a living thing after the monsoon, slow, heavy, and close. A ceiling fan chopped at the humidity with a tired mechanical whine, pushing cigarette smoke into loose spirals that never quite dispersed. Colonel Raymond Davis of the U.S. Marine Corps stood over the operations table with both palms resting on its edge, feeling the soft ripple of laminated grid squares under his fingers. His briefing had been precise, structured, and generous. Battalion strength sweep, layered blocking forces, rotary wing overwatch, fixed wing on call, firepower arranged like architecture. He had delivered it with the calm assurance of a man used to solving problems with scale. Across from him, Major Harry Smith of the Australian Task Force listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing impatient, nothing impressed. His eyes stayed on the map, but not on the colored arrows. He seemed to be studying the empty green spaces between them, the terrain not yet claimed by ink. Outside, somewhere beyond the sandbag walls, a helicopter spooled up, blades thumping the air into submission. The vibration crept through the tent poles and into the table. Davis waited for the acknowledgement that usually followed such a proposal, the professional nod, the bargaining questions, the cooperative refinements. Instead, Smith lifted his gaze and gave a small, courteous smile that did not reach fatigue-lined eyes. "Unsuitable," he said. Just one word, not sharp, not dismissive in tone, almost apologetic in delivery, but final. The fan kept turning, paper edges fluttered, someone at the radio coughed and pretended not to listen. Davis thought he had misheard. In his experience, refusals came wrapped in logistics, timelines, shortages, competing priorities. Refusals had paragraphs, this one had a period. "I'm not sure I follow," he said evenly, careful to keep rank from entering his voice. "We are offering lift, armor support, and extended perimeter control. You're operating under strength in that sector." Smith nodded once, as if confirming a correct statement in a different conversation. "Yes." "Then help me understand." A pause settled, not hostile, but immovable. Smith reached forward and adjusted the map slightly, rotating it a few degrees. It was a small gesture, almost polite housekeeping, but when he spoke again, it was clear the subject had already been decided somewhere deeper than this tent. "Too large," he said quietly, "too loud, too visible." From the American perspective, visibility was dominance. You showed presence, you controlled the ground. Davis felt a tightness behind his ribs, not anger yet, but friction. He had read the Australian reports, efficient, disciplined, but this was different. This was rejection of advantage. Weeks later, in a stateside archive, 3 declassified letters would sit in a single folder, their carbon copies fading unevenly, each written by a different American liaison officer, each circling the same confusion with increasingly careful language. Cooperative posture maintained, joint opportunities declined without actionable rationale, cultural divergence suspected, clarification requested. None received a clarifying answer. Back in the tent, Smith's finger traced a narrow contour line on the map, a fold in the land where rubber met scrub and scrub thickened toward jungle. His nail paused at a barely marked creek bed. "Movement here," he said, almost to himself. "You won't see it from the air, but they use it." Davis leaned closer. "Then we close it." "With a company," Smith replied softly, "you announce it." In the tree line beyond the cleared perimeter, an unseen observer lay still beneath a poncho darkened with leaf stain and mud. He had been there since before sunrise, listening to the base wake. Different armies sounded different when they moved. The Americans were engines and metal and shouted distance. The Australians were fewer sounds, spaced apart, harder to count. He did not know doctrine, he knew patterns, and patterns kept you alive. Inside the command tent, Courtesy held the temperature just below confrontation. Institutional pride wore a friendly face. Davis recognized it because Marines wore their own version. But this pride bent toward subtraction, not addition. Fewer men, smaller patrols, narrower signatures. It felt, to him, like choosing weakness on purpose. Major, Davis said more quietly now, with respect, you're turning down protection. Smith's expression shifted for the first time, not offense, not agreement, something closer to regret. No, he answered, we're turning down interference. The word landed gently and still managed to bruise. From a higher command vantage point, cooperation was a moral good, almost a strategic reflex. Allies combined strength. Each shared burden, multiplied pressure, but in certain terrains, multiplication changed shape. Noise compounded, tracks overlapped, radio traffic thickened. The jungle did not just hide the enemy, it listened for excess. Hale, then still a staff sergeant temporarily attached as a cross-unit observer, would later remember standing at the tent's edge, pretending to study a signal log while absorbing every word. He remembered the smell most clearly: damp canvas, hot dust, tobacco, and underneath it, the metallic scent of restrained disagreement. He had expected rivalry. What he witnessed was something stranger: professionals declining to help the way surgeons decline unsterile tools. Davis straightened, rolling his shoulders once beneath the weight of expectation and unanswered questions. If circumstances change, he said, formality returning like armor, the offer stands. Smith gave a respectful nod. Understood. No bridge burned, no voice raised, just a door closed with perfect manners. Outside, the light was flattening toward evening, sun diffused through high clouds into a pale, uncertain glow. The cleared ground around Nui Dat looked exposed, almost fragile against the dark wall of vegetation beyond. Firepower slept on pads of pierced steel planking. Radios hummed. Men cleaned weapons that would soon be loud again. But beyond the wire, in the layered green where sound died quickly and footprints died faster, another philosophy of war was already in motion, one that treated mass as risk, silence as cover, and restraint as a weapon. And until you understood that philosophy, every generous offer of strength would continue to sound, to them, unsuitable. 3 weeks before the silence that would later feel supernatural, before the stories of men who seemed to pass through jungle without bending grass, there was a plantation where noise ruled everything. August 18, 1966, Phuoc Tuy province. The rubber trees stand in perfect colonial rows, pale trunks rising like pillars, their high leaves filtering the monsoon sky into a dim green haze, orderly on a map, deceptive on the ground. Beneath them, the earth is slick, breathing mud. Private Paul Large is 21 years old and trying not to think about how new his boots still feel. The leather hasn't learned his feet yet. Every step reminds him he doesn't belong here, not fully, not like the older men whose gear hangs, as if grown onto their bodies. His rifle feels heavier than it did in training. Everything does. Sweat crawls down his spine. The air is thick enough to chew. Each breath tastes like wet bark and fertilizer, and the distant rot of leaves that never fully dry. The patrol had been routine in tone, at least at the start. A probing movement, a presence patrol, walk, observe, report. The kind of mission officers describe with calm verbs, but routine is fragile in Vietnam. It breaks without warning. The first crack is not loud, not cinematic, just a sharp tearing snap that seems to unzip the air beside Paul's ear. A rubber tree behind him coughs white sap like blood in reverse. For half a second, his brain refuses translation. Then comes the chorus, automatic fire hammering from multiple angles, bullets shearing bark, slapping mud, whining through branches. The plantation transforms into a geometry of death. He drops because his body drops. Training bypasses thought. His cheek hits wet soil. The smell is immediate: metallic mud, crushed leaves, the sourness of disturbed fungus. Someone is shouting arcs and bearings. Someone else is screaming. He cannot tell which voice is which. Warrant Officer Jack Kirby does not raise his voice. That is the first strange anchor in the chaos. He has heard this volume before in Malaya years earlier when another jungle tried to swallow another patrol. His face is lined not by age alone but by recognition. Ambush has a signature, weight of fire, directional overlap, patience in the trigger rhythm. This is not harassment. This is a net closing. Steady, he says, almost conversationally, moving through the line in a crouch, tapping shoulders, correcting angles with 2 fingers. Make them pay for every meter. Measured aggression, not fury, not panic, a doctrine built on breath control and mathematics. Every rifleman fires with count and pause, count and pause. The rhythm is taut like a heartbeat. Too fast and the barrel climbs, magazines empty, fear takes over. Too slow and the wave reaches you. The balance is everything. From the other side of the plantation, through curtains of rain beginning to fall, a Viet Cong company commander watches the Australian line through binoculars fogged at the edges. He had expected collapse by now, the usual pattern, patrol surprised, perimeter fractures, men run in 1s and 2s. Instead he sees something else, a line that bends but does not dissolve. Fire spaced evenly, no waste, no wild muzzle climb. It unnerves him. He signals another flanking push. Numbers will break them. Numbers always break them. The rain thickens, drumming on leaves so loudly it almost masks the gunfire. Almost. Paul Large reloads with fingers that feel carved from someone else's hands. He counts rounds without realizing he's counting. 4 left. Change. The magazine clicks in with a sound absurdly small compared to the violence around him. He remembers the range instructor's voice correcting his grip weeks ago and wonders, distantly, if that man knows where his lessons are being tested. Artillery is requested, not as desperation but as extension. Coordinates spoken carefully, repeated, verified. Far away guns pivot. Mathematics travels faster than fear. When the first shells arrive, they do not sound like explosions at first. They sound like the sky being torn open. The ground lifts and slams. Shockwaves punch the chest cavity. The chemical stink of propellant rolls through the wet air, mixing with monsoon steam into a bitter fog that coats the tongue. American voices crackle over the radio net, offering reinforcement, extraction, rescue wrapped in urgency. The word rescue hangs there. Kirby hears it. So does the company commander. They refuse it, not from pride alone, but from doctrine. Movement under this pressure would mean disintegration. Better the anvil than the road. Better controlled fire than crowded salvation. From above, if anyone could see through the storm ceiling, the battle would look impossibly small, a smudge of violence in ordered rows of trees, yet inside it, time distorts. Minutes become muscular, heavy. Each second must be pushed forward manually. The Viet Cong assaults come in pulses, rush, fire, fall, regroup, bodies appearing between trunks like figures stepping through curtains. Many are young, some are very young. Kirby sees one drop and feels the old, unwelcome recognition. Skill wasted on the wrong uniform is still skill. War does not erase that truth. It makes it painful. Paul fires, pauses, breathes, fires again. Terror does not vanish. It becomes structured, boxed into drills. He is shaking, but the sights still return to center. Around him, men he shared cigarettes with yesterday are now reduced to boots and elbows and muzzles protruding from mud. Identity narrows to function. Hours pass this way, not heroically, not gloriously, but stubbornly. Discipline becomes a wall more durable than numbers. Bodies accumulate in the approaches, evidence of arithmetic no speech can soften. The assaults are thin, then thin again. When the firing finally fractures into scattered shots, and then into nothing, the silence feels artificial, like hearing has failed. Rain continues alone, rinsing smoke from leaves, tapping helmets, cooling barrels. Steam rises from the ground, as if the plantation itself is exhaling. Paul Large sits back on his heels and realizes he is still alive with a kind of surprise that feels almost embarrassing. His ears ring. His throat tastes like pennies. He looks at Kirby, who is already walking the line, checking men, adjusting fields of view even now, because habits do not switch off with gunfire. Later counts will be made, ratios calculated, headlines written. The battle will become proof, cited in briefings, in arguments, in quiet national comparisons about methods and philosophies. Evidence that restraint, spacing, and controlled violence can defeat mass. But here, in the cooling mud, myth has not formed yet. Only exhaustion has, only the trembling after. And far beyond this plantation, in commands and capitals, another military culture is preparing to apply the opposite equation: more guns, more aircraft, more fire, convinced that weight itself is victory. The question hangs, unanswered, drifting forward into the next encounter like distant thunder. When a measured method meets overwhelming abundance, which one actually understands the jungle, and which one is only louder inside it? Night in the bush teaches arithmetic differently than night on a firebase. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Khan remembers the sound first, not gunfire, not helicopters, but silence measured in heartbeats. Australian patrols lying still beneath a jungle canopy so dense it turns starlight into rumor. Men spaced like careful punctuation across the slope, rifles resting on roots, safeties already off, fingers disciplined and patient. No whispered chatter, no nervous metal clicks. Even breath is rationed. In this tradition, noise is a debt you may not be able to repay. He once told a visiting liaison that Australian doctrine was born from distance more than ideology. A continent far from supply lines, a military never large enough to waste itself. Gallipoli ghosts still whispering through training manuals, every round carried by hand, every resupply uncertain, every mistake permanent. Fire discipline wasn't romantic, it was inherited necessity. One shot meant one decision. You learn to make them count or live with the consequence of not having another. Across the table from him. That day sat Captain Mike Brennan, boots still red with laterite dust, shoulders sore from a loadout that felt, to him, strangely light. 200 rounds, 4 magazines accessible, the rest sealed and packed. No belt-fed cushion. No immediate air cover stacked overhead on call signs and altitude blocks. He kept nodding as Khan spoke, but inside, something resisted the logic like a bone set slightly wrong. Because Brennan came from a different inheritance, the inheritance of abundance. He remembers his first night on an American firebase in country, generators growling like chained animals, floodlights bleaching the perimeter into artificial day, the smell of diesel braided with burnt coffee and gun oil, crates stacked chest-high with linked ammunition, mortar tubes already dialed with reference stakes, radios alive with overlapping voices. In that system, control meant dominance through volume, of fire, of mobility, of response speed. You didn't starve the battlefield, you overwhelmed it. Why carry less? One gunner had told him back then, grinning as he fed another belt into the tray, when you can carry enough to end the argument fast. Neither philosophy was careless, neither was naive, but they were shaped by different fears. Khan walks a map board under red light, tracing patrol routes with a grease pencil. Australian movement lines curve around likely contact zones like water around stone. Avoidance is not cowardice here, it is leverage. You don't announce presence unless presence is the weapon. He recalls patrol reports where entire missions ended without a shot fired and were counted as perfect success. Intelligence gathered, trails mapped, patterns understood, ammunition untouched, and therefore available tomorrow. He thinks in margins and endurance, in campaigns measured by how long you can remain effective without being seen. Brennan thinks in windows and shock. He has watched American units make first contact and immediately expand the fight outward, machine guns opening, smoke deployed, air requested before the second magazine runs dry. Violence used like a curtain dropped hard and fast. The idea is simple: seize initiative through undeniable force, make the enemy react, then crush the reaction. The first time he moved with an Australian patrol, the weight difference unsettled him more than he expected. Packs leaner, bandoliers counted. Even the rations smelled different, denser, plainer, chosen for caloric efficiency over comfort. No extra batteries just in case. no speculative gear. Every item was justified. Every gram was interrogated. "Where's the rest of it?" he'd asked quietly. The patrol sergeant looked at him, not unkindly. "This is the rest of it." In the tree line, waiting for dusk, Brennan became aware of new sounds, the small betrayals he'd stopped noticing in louder units. Fabric brushing bark, my throat cleared too sharply, a sling buckle nudging metal. Each noise drew a glance, not anger but recalibration. Sound here was treated like light discipline, something you shield instinctively. Later, when distant gunships thudded across the horizon chasing someone else's fight, he felt an unexpected emotion bloom under his ribs. Not relief, not envy, something closer to exposure. As if abundance, once removed, revealed how much of his confidence had been externally supplied. From higher command briefings, the contrast looks clean on acetate overlays. Two doctrines, two valid paths. Khan presents it that way when required, measured, professional, respectful. He emphasizes outcomes, not judgments, but in private moments, he admits the friction is not theoretical. Shared operations magnify philosophical differences into tactical hazards. He has seen joint patrol plans fracture over a single question: what do you do at first contact? The American answer tends toward escalation dominance, fix, suppress, call wait from the sky. The Australian answer leans toward contraction, break contact, fade, re-engage on chosen terms. Both approaches are internally coherent. Together, they can become mutually disruptive. One side calling thunder while the other is trying to become mist. Brennan remembers a rehearsal where he recommended pre-authorized air triggers tied to grid squares. The Australian warrant officer, listening, rubbed his jaw and said, "Or we could not be there when they look." It wasn't sarcasm, it was a worldview. In the field, these differences are not academic. They live in muscle memory, in how quickly a safety clicks off, in how long a finger waits before pressing, in whether your first instinct is to lower your profile or raise your volume. Brennan has felt the internal tug-of-war mid-movement, training pulling one way, environment another. The psychological fatigue of translation layered on top of operational stress. Khan, reviewing mixed unit after-action reports, notices something else: doubt creeping in at the edges. Scarcity-trained soldiers watching abundance deployed and wondering if restraint is risk. Abundance-trained soldiers watching restraint succeed and wondering if volume is dependency. Respect grows, but so does quiet second-guessing. Identity friction, professional pride under gentle pressure. On one ridge at dusk, an Australian ambush line lies in total darkness, rifles aligned on a narrow track, insects stitching the air with static. No one speaks, not even on the net. The trap is built from patience. 20 kilometers away, an American firebase vibrates with generator thunder and distant outgoing artillery, the night sky briefly turning white, then black again. The trap there is built from reach. Two different ways to bend the same darkness. And as joint missions increase, as radios share frequencies and maps share grids, one question moves closer, heavier, unavoidable. When soldiers shaped by scarcity stand beside soldiers shaped by abundance, which instinct yields first, and what fails in the moment it does? The first sign that the operation was wrong came not from the maps, nor the briefings, nor even the arguments, but from the sound. The jungle in Phuoc Tuy province had a rhythm Sergeant Bill Akel trusted. Insects wrote the baseline. Distant birds marked the hours. The wind moved in layers. You could feel when your presence disrupted it. You could measure your visibility by how quickly the forest forgave your intrusion. On the morning Operation Paddington began, that rhythm was crushed flat beneath rotor thunder. Hueys tore the sky open in repeated waves, beating the canopy into submission, broadcasting arrival times and grid references to anyone with ears. Akel stood half-hidden at the tree line with his patrol from 7 RAR, face painted in dull greens and browns, watching the insertion pattern with a tightening jaw. The Americans called it overwhelming presence. He called it an announcement. Leaves shook loose, birds detonated upward. The jungle did not forgive this. Across the clearing, Lieutenant James Kozak of the 173rd Airborne felt the same vibration in his chest and read it differently. To him, it was reassurance, mobility, dominance, reach. He was 26, sharp-eyed, carrying laminated overlays and a belief that coordination multiplied power. Combined operations meant shared strength. That was the theory briefed at MACV. He did notice, however, that the Australians were not impressed. Their patrols stayed low even when standing. Their radios whispered instead of spoke. Their spacing suggested they expected to be hunted, not supported. Kozak interpreted it as caution bordering on stubbornness. The first friction arrived through radio static before it appeared in consequence. A U.S. forward element reported movement near a hedgerow cluster bordering a hamlet, fleeting figures, possible weapons. The call for fire went upward fast, clean and procedural. Grid, estimate, request. Akel heard the coordinates and felt cold irritation crawl up his spine. He knew that hamlet. His unit had spent 3 months building a fragile intelligence relationship there, a farmer who passed trail timings through his nephew, a shopkeeper who marked supply shifts by lantern placement. None of it written, all of it human. He grabbed the handset from his signaler before permission etiquette could interfere. Negative fire mission, he cut in, voice controlled but tight. Repeat negative, civilian structures, known contacts are friendly. Static, then an American voice, clipped and strained, movement confirmed, possible VC logistics node, fire mission stands. The first artillery round landed before the argument finished. The concussion rolled through the trees like a physical shove. Birds erupted in black clouds. The second round walked closer, then the third. From the American command net, it sounded like decisive action. From Akel's position, it sounded like 3 months of invisible work erased in 20 seconds. Kozak monitored the exchange from his command group, unease creeping under his professionalism. The strike had followed procedure, but the tone on the Australian net wasn't procedural, it was wounded. When the patrols moved forward to assess, the hamlet was splintered and smoking. Palm thatch roofs burned fast and dirty. A cooking pot lay overturned beside a shattered doorway. No weapons cache, no bunker system, just absence and fire. Akel walked the perimeter in silence, jaw flexing. Intelligence didn't just die when people died, it died when trust did. He keyed his mic once, then released it without speaking. By hour 30, stealth had become fiction. Every planned quiet approach route was shredded by helicopter traffic. American air mobility kept leapfrogging units aggressively, inserting blocking forces ahead of schedule. On overlays it looked efficient. On the ground, it sounded like an alarm bell dragged across the province. Akel's patrol lay motionless in scrub beside a narrow trail they had intended to observe. The insects had just resumed their Tiral pattern, a fragile acoustic camouflage, when rotor noise built again from the west. He closed his eyes briefly in disbelief. Roots burned, his scout whispered. They pulled back, again, third time that day. Each abort cost them position, patience, and psychological edge. You could not stalk what had already been warned. Kozak felt the resistance now in every coordination meeting. The Australians answered requests precisely but without warmth. Compliance without agreement. He pushed for tempo, doctrine demanded pressure. The enemy should never rest. Yet every acceleration created new friction with the Allied patrol leaders who insisted tempo without concealment was self-defeat. The breaking point came at the tree line. Late afternoon, heat thick as wet cloth. An aerial observer reported suspected bunker shadowing along a dark vegetation wall beyond a dry paddy. Thermal distortion and movement flicker, ambiguous but plausible. Cossacks' air liaison recommended immediate napalm authorization before targets dispersed. From the command frequency, it sounded like an opportunity. From Akel's binoculars, it looked like a gardener's boundary line and 3 concealed trail entries used by his sources. He moved fast, faster than rank etiquette allowed, pushing through the command knot as Cossack reached for the handset confirmation. "Negative," Akel said sharply. Cossack glanced at him, startled. "Sergeant, step back. Those trees sit on top of a footpath network we've been mapping for 6 weeks, Akel said. You burn that, you blind every patrol working this sector. Or we remove a fortified position, Cossack countered, voice tightening. We don't get perfect certainty in combat. Akel stepped closer and put a hand on the handset, not aggressive, but immovable. You're about to light up your own intelligence grid. For a moment, the only sound was radio hiss and distant rotor chop. Cossacks saw not insubordination, but conviction, the kind forged by ground truth instead of overlays. And beneath his irritation came a harder realization. They were fighting 2 different wars on the same map. He lowered the handset slowly. The air liaison officer swore under his breath. The strike window closed. Neither man felt victorious. That night the radios carried arguments wrapped in formal language, operational interference, doctrine variance, command friction, words polished enough for reports, sharp enough to wound. Patrols began declining joint taskings on technical grounds, noise compromise, route exposure, asset conflict. Cooperation became administrative instead of tactical. The jungle, meanwhile, adapted. Opposing force scouts, patient, observant, began tracking helicopter cycles instead of ground traces. They learned the rhythm of American arrival and Australian withdrawal. In their perspective, the Allied force had split into 2 predictable animals sharing one skin. Operation Paddington ended ahead of schedule under the label of objective saturation achieved. No one on the ground used that phrase afterward. Akel wrote his patrol notes by red-filtered torch, each line precise, unemotional, devastating in implication. Cossack drafted his summary twice, deleting every sentence that sounded like blame and every sentence that sounded like doubt, discovering those were most of them. The after-action reports disappeared into classification channels for decades. Officially, it was a coordination trial. Unofficially, it was a fracture. And in the quiet that followed, after the helicopters left, and the insects slowly reclaimed the air, one question lingered in both men's thoughts like unresolved echo. When allies fight differently, who decides which truth survives the paperwork, and which one gets buried with the noise? In war, the loudest force is not always the most decisive. Sometimes the war is decided in rooms so quiet you can hear porcelain touch wood. Captain Robert O'Neill learned this in Phuoc Tuy province, where the air hung heavy with humidity and suspicion in equal measure. By day, the rubber plantations stood in regimented rows, their pale trunks rising like columns in a cathedral of filtered light. By night, the same trees became vertical shadows, indistinguishable from the men who moved between them. O'Neill worked from a modest intelligence cell at Nui Dat, a base carved into red earth that clung stubbornly to boots and cuffs. The operations room smelled of damp canvas and stale coffee. Maps lined the walls, their surfaces scarred with grease pencil annotations. American liaison officers sometimes visited, arriving with rolled aerial photographs and stacks of signal intercept summaries, dense, technical, impressive. They spoke of sensor fields dropped along infiltration routes, seismic detectors calibrated to differentiate footsteps from rainfall, aircraft that could photograph canopy disturbances invisible to the naked eye. It was a different language of war, a technological dialect. O'Neill respected it, but he also knew what it could not hear. In the village of Long Tan, Nguyen Van Than prepared tea as he always did, slowly, deliberately, as though the ritual itself were a form of negotiation. The kettle hissed softly over charcoal. Steam coiled into the late afternoon light, carrying the faint bitterness of green leaves. When Australian civil affairs teams approached, they did so without spectacle. No rotor wash bending palm fronds, no armored tracks carving trenches through rice paddies. Just boots on dirt, the low murmur of voices, weapons slung but not brandished. They would remove their sunglasses before greeting him. It was a small gesture. Than noticed such things. He had lived through the French. He now lived between the Viet Cong and the Americans. Each side claimed legitimacy. Each demanded allegiance. Survival required calibration. When American cordon and search operations swept through neighboring hamlets, they arrived like sudden weather. Helicopters hammered the sky, flattening conversation beneath mechanical thunder. Soldiers formed perimeters, shouting instructions through interpreters whose dialect sometimes betrayed them as outsiders. Men were separated from women. Identity cards inspected. Homes searched with urgency bordering on anger. Than understood the American logic. They sought control, dominance, immediate results. But control is not the same as trust. Months earlier, a young American lieutenant had asked him directly in halting Vietnamese, "Where are the Viet Cong?" The question hung in the air, blunt and dangerous. Than smiled faintly and shrugged. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Within hours, 3 houses were dismantled in the search for a weapons cache that did not exist. That night, Viet Cong cadres visited quietly, reminding the village of consequences. When the Australians asked questions, they did so sideways. Captain O'Neill would later read the transcripts of those conversations, noting the indirect phrasing, the patience embedded in pauses. Than might speak first of harvest yields, then of a cousin's illness, then of how certain young men seemed absent during festivals. Names would surface not as accusations, but as anecdotes. The Australians listened. Trust accumulated like sediment, thin layers at first, almost imperceptible. A bag of rice delivered without fanfare, medical supplies provided without interrogation, a patrol that chose to walk rather than fly. O'Neill understood that intelligence was less about extraction than cultivation. In classified summaries he compiled for Canberra, he traced the slow mapping of Viet Cong infrastructure across Phuoc Tuy. Tax collectors identified, political officers named, supply caches located with surgical precision. Australian units repeatedly uncovered local networks that larger American formations operating nearby had missed. The difference was not competence, it was a footprint. American firepower reshaped terrain physically and socially. Artillery craters scarred fields. Search operations humiliated elders in front of their communities. Even when conducted with restraint, the scale of presence altered the emotional geometry of a village. Suspicion replaced conversation. Fear replaced nuance. From Saigon, American commanders viewed the war through metrics: sorties flown, enemy killed, hamlets secured. Intelligence flowed upward in volume. It felt comprehensive, but volume can obscure clarity. One evening, as cicadas pulsed in rhythmic waves beyond his home, Than leaned closer to an Australian interpreter and spoke with quiet intensity. "If I speak to the Americans," he said, "I lose face with my people. If I do not speak, they think I hide something. With you, it is slower. There is space." Space, that was the invisible currency. O'Neill wrestled privately with the irony that sustained him. Australian methods depended on subtlety, on minimizing disruption, yet they operated within a broader American war effort defined by abundance of helicopters, artillery, men. The Americans fixed large enemy units, absorbed massive engagements. Their presence shielded smaller allies from existential pressure. And yet that same abundance often suffocated the delicate human networks upon which counterinsurgency depends. In one classified after-action report, O'Neill highlighted a pattern. Villages subjected to repeated American cordon operations produced fewer actionable tips. In contrast, areas where Australian patrols maintained consistent, low-visibility engagement yielded a steady trickle of intelligence, not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but cumulative. He could feel the tension even within his own ranks. Some Australian soldiers grew impatient. They saw American battalions unleash overwhelming force and wondered if patience was simply caution disguised as virtue. The enemy still moved at night. Mines still detonated beneath convict wheels. The jungle remained indifferent. But intelligence built through fear collapse. Ease quickly. Intelligence built through relationship endures longer until it too is broken. From the perspective of a Viet Cong district cadre, the distinction was tactical. American operations were loud, predictable in their scale. One could disperse before the helicopters arrived, melt into tunnels, reassemble later. Australian patrols, smaller and quieter, were harder to anticipate. They arrived without warning, sometimes guided by information that should not have existed. Someone was talking. And yet, that someone would never have spoken under the roar of rotor blades. As dusk settled over Phuoc Tuy, darkness thickened between the rubber trees. In Nui Dat, O'Neill closed another intelligence summary, the paper soft from humidity. He understood that operational philosophy was not abstract doctrine. It determined who whispered and who remained silent. It shaped the moral terrain as surely as artillery shaped earth. If overwhelming force eroded the very social fabric required for insight, then power carried its own blindness. And as the war widened, as American abundance intensified, one question lingered in the humid air. If the tools meant to win a counterinsurgency destroy the intelligence that makes victory possible, what does that reveal about how this war would ultimately end? After Paddington, the arguments stopped. There was no formal announcement, no dramatic rupture between flags, just fewer joint briefings, fewer shared patrol plans, a subtle thinning of liaison traffic across the dusty corridors of headquarters. MACV did not issue a proclamation, it simply redirected its attention elsewhere. In Phuoc Tuy province, Colonel Stuart Graham felt the shift the way a seasoned bushman feels a change in wind direction through absence. The Americans were no longer asking how the Australians intended to clear a hamlet or dominate a patch of rubber plantation. They had their own operations, larger and louder, unfolding beyond the low hills. On Nui Day, the Australian task force settled deeper into its own rhythm. From above, their base barely scarred the land. Perimeter wire hugged the earth. Bunkers were sandbagged and sunken, roofs covered in camouflage netting that dulled their outline from the air. Patrols moved out at first light in small files, boots brushing dew from elephant grass, radios kept to disciplined whispers. The jungle absorbed them within meters. Graham would stand over the operations table at dusk, red light bathing the map, and trace the arcs of his companies with a grease pencil. 3-year rotations meant the men around him knew the ground intimately. Platoon commanders remembered where trails flooded in monsoon season, which village elder had lost a son to the Viet Cong and which had quietly turned against them. Institutional memory lived not in binders, but in men. Across the province boundary, American firebases cut a different silhouette. Massive berms of bulldozed earth rose like defensive castles. Timber was stripped from surrounding tree lines to create clear fields of fire. Concertina wire glinted in harsh floodlights. Helicopters hammered the sky at all hours, rotors beating humidity into submission. Generators roared through the night, feeding command centers that glowed electric against the darkness. Power was visible there, audible, measurable in tonnage of artillery and number of sorties flown. So were the targets. In a bamboo thicket a kilometer from one such firebase, a Viet Cong scout lay motionless, eyes fixed on the halo of light against the night sky. He did not need sophisticated intelligence to understand patterns. Helicopters arrived at predictable intervals. Patrols pushed out aggressively, then rotated home. New faces appeared every few months, tired, wary, learning the terrain just as their predecessors had begun to grasp it. The Australians, by contrast, returned season after season. Faces aged but remained. They walked slowly, sometimes almost lazily, as if unthreatened, but their spacing was exact. Their halts are deliberate. They did not chase noise, they listened. The numbers accumulated quietly. By 1971, the Australian task force had sustained the lowest casualty rate of any Allied force in Vietnam. Their enemy kill ratios remained disproportionately high. They did not trumpet body counts at press briefings. They measured effectiveness in disrupted supply lines, in villages that stayed neutral, in nights without incoming mortar fire. Graham read the reports without celebration. Vindication felt restrained, almost melancholy. Success in a narrow province did not alter the broader trajectory of the war. He knew context mattered. Australia controlled one province with a cohesive force. The Americans were managing an entire country layered with political constraints and logistical enormity. Still, the contrast was undeniable. Major David Hackworth saw it too. By 1970, he was already a legend in his own army, hard-edged, relentless, allergic to complacency. W.H. N. He visited Australian positions. He noted what wasn't there. No blaring rock music over loudspeakers, no unnecessary movement, no swagger. He watched an Australian platoon step off on a patrol just before dawn. They moved like a single organism, intervals precise, eyes scanning not for dramatic contact, but for subtle disturbance. One soldier paused to touch a broken twig, studying the sap still wet at the edge. No one rushed him. Hackworth felt a flicker of frustration that bordered on envy. This was counterinsurgency stripped to essentials: cohesion, patience, continuity. Back with his own battalion, he tried to graft those lessons onto American structure. He tightened formations, reduced reliance on heavy fire support when unnecessary, demanded his officers memorize villages, not just grid coordinates. He pushed for extended patrol durations, for living among the terrain rather than orbiting it from fortified hills. But the 12-month tour system loomed over everything. Men arrived green and left just as they were becoming competent. Units dissolved into replacements. Institutional knowledge evaporated with each rotation flight home. Promotions and evaluations were tied to metrics that favored visible results: enemy killed, areas cleared, operations launched. Hackworth could bend his battalion. He could not bend the army. At night, sitting on an ammunition crate outside his command bunker, sweat cooling on his neck, he stared at casualty summaries. He knew bravery was not the issue. His soldiers fought hard. They endured ambushes, booby traps, and sudden violence with grim determination. The problem was structural inertia. By the time American commanders began quietly sending observers to study Australian methods, the war was already grinding toward an endgame. Young officers walked the rubber plantations with notebooks, asking careful questions about patrol intervals and village engagement strategies. Professional respect had replaced earlier condescension. But adaptation at scale was a different kind of battle. An army of hundreds of thousands cannot pivot overnight. Logistics chains, training pipelines, promotion systems, political expectations, all resist abrupt transformation. To restructure would require admitting that the dominant model had been ill-suited for this kind of war. Institutions do not confess easily. Graham understood this without bitterness. He respected American capability. He had seen its raw force. He also recognized its limitations in a conflict defined by shadows and memory rather than front lines. As Australian withdrawal approached, the separation hardened into precedent. Combined operations were no longer debated. They simply ceased to exist. Two allies, fighting parallel wars in the same country, operating under different philosophies. Professional respect endured. Hackworth admired the Australians' craft. Graham acknowledged the immense burden the Americans carried, but the operational divide became permanent policy. In the end, no one declared victory in doctrine. The Australians proved that, in their province, a smaller, cohesive force rooted in continuity could suppress an insurgency with relatively lower cost. The Americans demonstrated unmatched power and reach, yet struggled to translate scale into sustainable control. The jungle kept its own counsel, and the question lingered long after the last helicopters lifted off. If one method fit the terrain more naturally, why couldn't the larger institution reshape itself to match it? Was effectiveness determined by insight, or by the willingness of an organization to become smaller, quieter, and more patient than its own design allowed? The answer, like the war itself, remained suspended in the heavy air, unresolved. The photographs have faded at the edges. In a quiet RSL club outside Brisbane, afternoon light filters through Venetian blinds, striping the carpet in bands of gold and shadow. Dust hangs in the air like memory made visible. On the wall, framed images of young men in jungle greens stare back at the room, lean faces, sunburned necks, eyes that had not yet learned the cost of clarity. Major Harry Smith sits beneath them, now in his 80s, his hands folded over a cane that once steadied him through monsoon mud. The fingers are swollen with age, knuckles thickened, skin papered thin. Those same hands once gripped an SLR rifle so tightly his forearms trembled for hours afterward. Now they tremble for different reasons. Across the Pacific, in a modest VFW hall in Virginia, retired Colonel Raymond Davis adjusts his glasses and studies a similar photograph. The American liaison officer who once argued policy over maps and radio frequencies now traces the outline of a younger version of himself with the pad of his thumb. The fluorescent lights hum above him. Coffee brews somewhere behind the bar, bitter and metallic. For decades, each man had carried his own version of the story. They called us difficult, some America. NS had said about the Australians, uncooperative, stubborn. We called them reckless, some Australians had muttered in return, loud, heavy-handed. The words were easy when the war was still hot. But time cools language. Harry remembers Vietnam not as headlines but as humidity. The jungle pressed in on every patrol, green walls swallowing sound, turning distance into illusion. His men moved in small numbers, deliberate and slow, reading the terrain like scripture. Every broken twig mattered. Every cooking fire's smoke told a story. Their footprint was light because it had to be. Supply lines were thin. Air support was never guaranteed. Survival depended on patience and discipline, on knowing when not to engage. He remembers the tension in his chest when American artillery thundered miles away, shaking the canopy. The shockwaves carried through the ground like distant anger. Industrial war, massive, relentless. It had its own logic: air dominance, mass mobilization, the ability to move battalions like chess pieces across provinces. Raymond had believed in that logic. He still does, in part. He remembers standing in operations, tents thick with cigarette smoke, maps pinned with colored grease pencils marking firebases and landing zones. The scale was staggering. helicopters beating the sky into submission, convoys stretching beyond the horizon. It was a war built on movement and momentum. From his perspective, the Australians seemed almost minimalist, too cautious, too independent. From Harry's perspective, the Americans were fighting the terrain instead of listening to it. Neither man was wrong. Decades later, the realization arrives not like revelation, but like erosion, slow, undeniable. In 2008, the mountains of Afghanistan replaced jungle canopy with jagged rock and dust-choked valleys. The Australian Special Operations Task Group operated again with a small footprint, long rotations, and cultural patience carved from hard lessons. They cultivated local relationships carefully, wary of overwhelming fragile alliances. Resource discipline remained instinctive. Move quietly, stay lean, learn the ground. American forces, still vast, still powerful, brought air dominance and logistics that could flood a valley with capability overnight. Entire districts could transform under the weight of equipment and manpower. It was not arrogance, it was architecture, a system designed for scale. On paper, they fought the same insurgency. In practice, they fought different wars layered over the same soil. Harry watches footage from Afghanistan on a muted television in the corner of the RSL. Young Australians stepping out of armored vehicles into ochre dust, rifles low but ready. Their movements remind him of another generation stepping into jungle shade. Different continents, same caution. Raymond reads after-action reports from that era and sees familiar patterns, American brigades rotating in and out, objectives expanding and contracting with political winds. He recognizes the strain in the language, metrics, surge, stabilization. He exhales slowly. We weren't built for their war, Harry says softly to no one in particular, his voice barely rising above the clink of glasses at the bar. In Virginia, Raymond murmurs something similar, as if answering across decades. They weren't built for us. The tragedy, they both understand now, is that everyone insisted it was the same war. In the RSL, a younger veteran approaches Harry with a photograph for signing. The paper is glossy, the faces sharp. Harry studies the image, young men crouched in Afghan scrub, eyes hidden behind ballistic glasses. He sees in them the same tension he once felt, the awareness that doctrine is a tool, not a shield. He signs carefully, his pen scratching faintly. At the VFW, Raymond closes the photo album and rests his palm against the cover. The weight of age sits differently than the weight of command. There are no radios now, no satellite feeds, only reflection. He remembers arguing with Australian officers years ago, frustration rising like heat. Why won't you commit more? Why won't you integrate fully? He understands now that integration is not always multiplication. Sometimes it is dilution. Built differently, not better. The silence in both halls grows comfortable. Outside, traffic passes, indifferent. The world has moved on to new conflicts, new doctrines, new promises of decisive victory. War does not care how you were built. It consumes scale and subtlety alike. Harry leans back in his chair, eyes drifting once more to the faded photographs. Raymond switches off the fluorescent lights and lets the room fall into shadow. They called us difficult, Harry says quietly. We called them reckless, Raymond answers miles away. They were both right. And the war, vast, indifferent, shapeless, did not care about either.